I'm thrilled and honored to be here. Candace is such an inspiration, and we are Blexit. And what does it mean to Blexit? What does it mean to get out? Where are we running to? What are we for? In some ways, our challenge is not merely one of breaking free of an ideology or a set of political principles or platforms. It's also freeing our mind from a pattern of lies that have been implanted there, lies that masquerade as truths, lies that have to be excavated out of us. And so there's an internal kind of struggle for us to free ourselves and be able to think for ourselves and choose for ourselves. Frederick Douglass, when he was a slave in Maryland, at one point went to his master, a fellow named Hugh Auld, and he told him that he was giving some thought to the future. And his master said to him, "Frederick, never think about the future. Let me do that. I will think about your future. I will make it happen in effect for you." And this got Douglass to sort of think about it, and he realized, ultimately, that this was the essence of slavery. The essence of slavery was that someone else controlled your fate. Someone else was in charge of your happiness, and you, in a sense, become nothing more than an eternal child dependent on them. Now, fast forward to the 1960s, when a very wily character, Saul Alinsky, was visited by a group of leftists who came to see him. George Bush, this is George H.W. Bush, was giving a speech at the United Nations, and these leftists had come up with a brilliant idea, or so they thought, and the idea was to have huge posters saying GOP equals KKK. The Republican Party is the party of the Klan. And so they showed these posters to Alinsky, and they go, "We're going to show up at this speech, and we're going to wave these posters that connect the Republicans and the conservatives to the KKK." And Alinsky took a look at it, and he goes, "Well, that's dumb. Don't do that. Let me give you a better idea." And Alinsky went into his closet, and he pulled off some white sheets, and he put them over his head. And he said, "Don't have these posters that say GOP equals KKK. You come dressed as the KKK. You put on the white sheets as if you are the Klan. And then you carry posters that say, 'We love George Bush. KKK loves Bush.'" And Alinsky's point is that if you do that, every time that Bush begins to speak, you guys just jump up and cheer wildly, as if you agree 100%. And Alinsky said, if you do that, the media, he might have as well said our media, will do the rest, which is to say, they will connect Bush with the Klan. Now, interestingly, Alinsky totally knew that the Democratic Party was the party of the Klan. He completely knew that not only did the Democrat Nathan Bedford Forrest start the Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee, but when the Republicans shut the Klan down and closed it for 30 years, another Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, revived the Klan in the early 20th century, and the Klan, which had been mainly a Southern organization, now became nationwide. So Alinsky knows all this. But Alinsky's point is that we, the Democrats, we, the left, have got to figure out a way to take this hated institution, this symbol of racial terrorism and murder, and we have to pin this tail not on the Democratic donkey where it belongs, but on the Republican elephant. We've got to figure out a way to do that. And we can count on our allies in academia and the media to support us in this enterprise of political deceit. And that's kind of what we're up against. We're up against not just a distortion of our current politics, but a distortion of the whole story of American life. Abraham Lincoln was a progressive, Dinesh. Abraham Lincoln would never have supported the policies that you conservatives stand for today. Abraham Lincoln would have been on the opposite end of what you believe. We hear this all the time. This is in the textbooks. This is in Wikipedia. So it's actually worth taking just a minute to see if that's actually true. What did Lincoln stand for? And are Lincoln's policies recognizable to us today as, let's say, continuous with the policies of Trump? Interestingly, when Lincoln defined slavery, he didn't define it in racial terms. He defined it in economic terms. Lincoln said that the essence of slavery is you work, I eat. You work, I eat. What that means is that you labor, but I take the fruit of your labor and appropriate it as my own. Slavery is theft. And ultimately, the crime of slavery is taking for yourself something that is not yours. And Lincoln says, this is the credo of the Democratic Party. This is what the left stands for. And then Lincoln says, and what about us? What about the Republican Party? What do we stand for? Lincoln says we stand for the opposite principle. In Lincoln's words, the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. In other words, we have the right to keep our stuff. We have the right to the fruits of our own labor. And this, says Lincoln, is the credo of the Republican Party. So think about it. Let's fast forward now all the way from Lincoln's times, and there have been a lot of changes in the landscape of politics, a lot of new issues that have come to the surface. But isn't it true that at the core, if today we were to define the Republican position on economics, couldn't it be simply stated as just this? The hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn in its own mouth. We believe that now. And similarly, if we were to define the position of the Democratic Party, in fact, if we were to define the essence of socialism, this new socialism that has migrated now to the heart of the Democratic Party, it's being embraced across the board. I realize there are some differences between Bernie and Biden. Bernie can at least remember his first name. But positionally, they're quite similar. Despite their nuanced difference on a couple of issues, on the majority of issues, if you made a list, from extending health care to illegals, and on down the list, their positions are pretty much the same. So this is not socialism versus non-socialism. It's almost open socialism versus stealth socialism. That's the difference. The Democrats are angry with Bernie because he won't shut up. He says what he really thinks. He's not a camouflage character. But the point I want to make is that if you were to summarize the essence of socialism, is it not accurately described in the single line that Lincoln himself quoted more than 150 years ago? You work, I eat. That's the essence of socialism. That's the essence of the Democratic Party. And so the Democrats are the same dirty, rotten scoundrels they always were. Now, socialism. You know, for the whole 4 years of Trump, we have not really had a single real public policy debate in this country. It's been Charlottesville and Stormy Daniels and the Mueller investigation and Russia collusion and impeachment and Ukraine. But now suddenly at the very end, you can say the clouds are parting and a big issue has come to the forefront: socialism. And for those of us who came of age in the latter part of the 20th century, we can hardly believe it. Socialism, really? Socialism is the most discredited idea since slavery. And in fact, socialism became discredited largely because I think people realized it's a form of slavery. It's a form of slavery. And so, in the middle of the last century, almost 2 in 3 people on this planet lived under socialism. The largest countries in the world, China, India, were socialist. I grew up under socialism. I was just a kid, but the 3 things I remember really well about socialism are: number 1, the ration card. It came along every month. You had to show your ration card, and that allowed you to buy this much of rice or this much of cooking oil. The ration card set the limit on how much you could buy. That's number 1. Number 2, corruption. Now, there's corruption everywhere, but corruption under socialism is so pervasive that you cannot literally move without paying someone under the table. You have to do it literally every single day. It becomes woven into the fabric of your life. It corrupts you as a person. You become essentially a shyster and a thief. And third, a 7-year wait to get a phone. So I grew up without a phone. Why? Because we were on a 7-year waiting list to get the phone. So socialism is this preposterous, unworkable scheme that impoverishes, immiserates, and tyrannizes. And so how can you possibly try to bring it back? To try to bring it back is kind of like if someone were to say, you know what, we're going to bring slavery back. I mean, think how insane that would be. If someone were to say, you know, slavery was a really good idea, but the implementation was poor. Every time it was tried, it was imperfectly executed. This time, we're really going to get it right. But this is exactly what people say about socialism. We're going to get it right this time. And, you know, here in the audience, my wife Debbie from Venezuela, and I mean, there is a country, it's one thing to grow up in a country like India, which was poor from time immemorial. You know, when I think about India, when I was growing up, people would say in America to their kids, hey Johnny, you better eat your food because there are millions of starving people in India. That was socialism. But you notice that India, starting in the late 1980s, started moving away from socialism, and people don't say that now. Now people say to their kids, Johnny, you better study really hard because some Indian is waiting somewhere to take your job. Asians used to be considered super dumb. Now they're considered super smart. But it's not because they got smarter, it's because their political system got better. But Venezuela, the tragedy of Venezuela is that this was a rich country, an oil-rich country that now has gas lines, that now basically has electrical blackouts. So, and the left, of course, what's funny is they'll say today, well, you know, Dinesh, we're not trying to become like Venezuela. We're not trying to become like Stalin or Mao or Lenin or Hitler. Well, we're not trying to do that kind of socialism. Our socialism is really different. Our model is Scandinavia. So I call this Sven socialism, based upon the idea that the typical Scandinavian is Sven. And Sven, of course, is not a very threatening guy. Sven is a kind of a metrosexual type of guy. He carries a lady's handbag. Even though he wears a suit, he bicycles to work. His furniture is all IKEA. And so people go, well, look, Sven's not a bad guy. People don't live badly in Norway or Sweden or Denmark. We'll take that as our model. But very interestingly, no one on the left goes to Scandinavia. They say that they want the Scandinavian model, but they don't ask what the Scandinavian model is. Interestingly, if you go to Scandinavia, there's some sort of a debate going on right now whether are the Scandinavian countries really capitalist or are they socialist? And the correct answer to that question, I think, is that the Scandinavians are completely capitalist in wealth creation and largely socialist in wealth distribution. In other words, the Scandinavians never killed the goose that lays the golden eggs. Their corporate tax rates are no higher and in some cases lower than the United States. What's the minimum wage in Scandinavia? There isn't one. What is the estate tax that limits how much money you can give to your family or your children? There is none. Give it all. Bernie Sanders wants to tax financial transactions on Wall Street. What's the Scandinavian transaction tax rate? 0%. So the Scandinavians, by and large, allow the capitalist engine to generate wealth. Then, and this is the key point, when the wealth is created, they tax it heavily, but they also tax everybody. The principle of Scandinavia is that we are a tribe. We're a single community, kind of like we were in the Viking days. And so when we get all this booty, all this wealth, we got to share it, but everybody has to work for it. And so when the people talk about Scandinavian tax rates, yes, those tax rates are 50, 60, and 70%. But you know who pays them? Pretty much everybody. In other words, those rates kick in at $50,000, $60,000, and $70,000 a year. So you make $60,000 a year, you've got to turn over $30,000 to $35,000 to the government straight away. In other words, there's no demonizing the rich. There's no going after the billionaires. The billionaire, after all, is also Sven. He's a member of the tribe. So the Scandinavians apply not only a high rate of taxation, but on top of the income tax rate, they have the VAT tax, 25%, and the VAT tax is notoriously heavier on the poor. So the Scandinavians don't soak the rich, they soak the poor. And you can see why this is not a recipe the Democrats want to go near, because it implies very high tax rates across the board for everybody. For everybody. Now, American socialism is unique, I think, in one important respect. This is actually what makes it different from the socialism of the past and even the socialism of Marx. The socialism of Marx was class-based socialism. And the basic idea is that American society is divided into two, the rich and the poor. Or to put it a little differently, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, or the working class. But the whole idea is that society is carved right down the middle, these two groups, and there are no other groups that matter. But in American politics, we have class socialism, yes, but it's married to identity politics. And so in America, the left will try to carve up society not two ways, the rich and the poor, but 8 different ways. Society is divided into the rich and the poor, but it's also divided into the black against the white. And it's also divided into the male against the female, and the straight against the gay, and the legal against the illegal. So the strategy of the left in this country is to cut American society into pieces 7 different ways, and then create this sort of community of victims across the board and try to carve out a Democratic majority out of those. If we can get 51% of those guys, we can then loot the other 49% with impunity. That's the formula. That's not the Scandinavian formula, by the way. And interestingly, as I've been thinking and talking to my wife about Venezuelan socialism, it's really incredible that all the features of American socialism can be found not in Scandinavia, but in Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez was first elected at the turn of the century in Venezuela, first of all, he denied he was a socialist. He said, I'm not a socialist. I'm not doing that. In fact, he said, although I have a 6-year term, if I'm not doing a good job in 5 years, I'll quit. I'll leave. But one thing Hugo Chavez did do is he introduced racial politics into Venezuela in a very explicit way. The racial politics was anti-colonial. Venezuela was a multiracial society. Italians, Germans, Asian Indians, Pakistanis, a whole bunch of people, whites, blacks in that society. Hugo Chavez basically mobilized the minorities against the whites. For the first time, Columbus Day, which was celebrated in Venezuela, outlawed. Columbus becomes a bad guy. So here's a common thread between Venezuela and America. In both countries, you have this kind of racialized identity socialism. The second thing that Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, very familiar to us, demonize the rich. He had a television program, and in fact, we're making a movie on this. We have footage of Hugo Chavez, and he's walking down the street, and the cameras of his own show, it's called Allo President, Allo Presidente, Hello President. They're following him, and he just says things like, who owns that building? And his advisor tells him, some Jew. And he goes, expropriate it. So he's confiscating the buildings as he walks down the street. Who owns that store? Some jewelers own it. Expropriate it. And literally the people in the store are moved into the street right then. So this attack on property and possessions and the rich, this is a feature of Venezuelan socialism. Here's the third feature of Venezuelan socialism, pretty recognizable. Basically, once Hugo Chavez got to power, he set about rigging the whole system so it would become impossible for the socialists to ever lose again. So he stacked the Supreme Court by adding more members to the court. There was a legislature with 2 houses of parliament. He abolished 1. And he created a kind of super legislature. So even if this parliament over here makes a law, that law doesn't become a law until this group, the super legislature, signs off on it. It's kind of like in Iran. You can have an elected government, but if they make a law, it means nothing until the mullahs sign off on it. Same in Venezuela. Rigging the system. 4, Hugo Chavez created his own Antifa. These guys are called the colectivos. They're usually former criminals. Hugo Chavez went to them and he basically said, I'm going to let you out, but my job is to militarize you. You become a kind of civilian military force, and when people protest the regime, by the way, I forgot to mention, guns are confiscated right before that. So the Venezuelans are disarmed, and disarmed so that they are defenseless against the state. And now in Venezuela, if you go out on the street to protest, some guys will show up on motorcycles with sticks and batons. They'll jump off and start beating you to a pulp. That's Venezuela's Antifa. Very familiar to us here in America. We're following this Venezuelan model. And finally, one more. I could keep going on, but one more. In Venezuela, politics is a way for the socialists to make a huge bunch of money. They get rich off of it. So you know how you look on TV now, Venezuelans are so poor, they're eating their pets, things are so bad in Venezuela, but not for everybody. Right now, if you go to the Buddha bar in Caracas, the wine is flowing, there are huge platters of food. The Chavistas, the socialist class, is living high on the hog. The family of Hugo Chavez is the richest family in the country and one of the richest in the world. Net worth, more than $1 billion. So think about this. Here in America, we have something of the same thing. The Clintons are broke after they leave the White House. They now have $250 million. The Obamas have $40 million. The Bidens have $150 million. Al Gore has over $100 million. By the way, none of these people do anything. They're all government employees. These are not people who do fracking and take oil out of the ground. They don't invent the iPhone. They don't figure out Amazon Prime. Somehow, through government leverage, they make money. Even Bernie Sanders, 3 houses. If he gets out of the Democratic race and endorses Biden, you can fairly expect that pretty soon he'll have house number 4. That'll show up somewhere. So here's the point. Name for me a Scandinavian politician that has gone from 0 to 40 million. That person does not exist. There's no Antifa in Scandinavia. There's no demonization of the rich. So the point I'm trying to make here is that for the left, although they won't say it, their real model is precisely the kind of gangster socialism that has destroyed Venezuela, and if we let it, will destroy the United States. Now, we won't let it. No. I want to say a word before I end about our man in the saddle, namely Donald Trump. Not only is Trump the political warrior in the fight against socialism, but I think Trump is also the embodiment of entrepreneurial capitalism. That's been his career, in being a builder and an innovator. When Trump was a young man in Queens, his father had a business of essentially collecting rents, mostly from rent-controlled apartments in Queens. And his father told Trump, this is kind of how you make money. Don't cross into Manhattan, just do this. And Trump is in his 20s, and what does he do? He strolls across the bridge into Manhattan. And he finds himself standing in front of Grand Central Station. This is in the late 70s. And the economy is actually doing very poorly. And right there in front of Grand Central Station is the Commodore Hotel. A historic hotel, but all run down, looks terrible. People are sleeping in the hallways. They can't charge $40 for somebody to use a room because nobody wants to go in there. And so Trump is looking at it, and then he looks around and he sees all these commuters coming out of Grand Central Station dressed in 3-piece suits, all marching off to work. And so he thinks to himself, wow, this would be such a convenient location for all these people, but look at this hotel. So he walks in and he says, I'm interested in buying this hotel. And he meets with the guy, and the hotel's for sale. And he asks the owners, how much do you want for this hotel? And they go, who are you? And he goes, I'm Donald Trump. And they go to ask the question differently, who are you? And he goes, listen, my family's in real estate, you don't know them, but here's what I want you to do. What is the price you're asking for this hotel? And they say $10 million. And Trump says, okay, here's a sheet of paper, sign right here that you will sell me this hotel for $10 million. And they think it's kind of a joke, and they go, oh yeah, okay, fine, here you go. And Trump takes that paper and he starts hitting every bank in the city. And he says, I'm the new owner of the Commodore Hotel. And the banks go, what? You? He goes, yeah, but I need some financing to close the deal. Here's the offer. I need $10 million. So just think about this. Here's Trump. His dad won't help him. He's trying to buy an expensive hotel. He doesn't own the hotel, and he doesn't have the money. And he's never run a hotel. But what he does is he's able to get city permits to do transformations to the hotel. He's able to convince the banks to lend him the money. He buys the hotel. He makes a deal with the Hyatt chain to manage the hotel. And then, in his Trumpian mode, he goes, we've got to completely change the front and the side and the back of the hotel and put mirrors on it. And everybody from the planning committees to the environmental people to the architectural critics go, this is ridiculous. That will destroy the neighborhood. It's completely out of sync with what this whole neighborhood looks like. And Trump goes, yeah, I know, but if I put mirrors on my hotel, then in my hotel, people can see Grand Central Station. They can see the Chrysler Building. They can see all these great monuments of New York reflected in my hotel. So the bottom line of it is, Trump does it. He owns the Commodore Hotel. He's in partnership with Hyatt. A few years later, they have a dispute. Hyatt buys him out. Trump makes, in a few years, $120 million. Now, this is not sort of Trump hagiography. I'm not doing this just to praise Trump. I'm doing this to say, first of all, that when Karl Marx described what entrepreneurs do, he described none of this. None of it. Entrepreneurs have the idea for a business. They have the organization to carry it out. They take all the risk. They show the marketing prowess to sell the product. Marx ignores all of it and basically acts as if the entrepreneur supplies only one thing, which actually most entrepreneurs do not supply, namely capital. That's why he called him capitalists. He acts like this is such a lazy guy who does no work, has no imagination, no ideas. He's just sitting on a mountain of cash. And that's all that entrepreneurs. So you see what's going on here. Right from the beginning, socialist propaganda was aimed at confusing our mind, and confusing our mind by creating categories. Who came up with the name capitalist? Marx did. Why? Because the moment you name something as capitalist, you get the idea that's all these people do. They're just money bags. They just sit on a bunch of cash. They don't do anything else. But in reality, entrepreneurs don't supply their own capital. You think Steve Jobs came up with his own dough to start Apple? No. He went to a venture capital firm. He went to a bank. Capitalists actually supply ideas, energy, innovation, marketing, and so on. So we have to make, I think, and this is the way to convince young people, the moral case for entrepreneurship, the moral case for free markets, and in the end of the day, we're making the moral case for what Frederick Douglass called many years ago, the self-made man. The self-made man. So, and I'll close on this. In his great speech on the self-made man, Douglass says, the self-made man is the only type of man who cuts his own path in life. Now, the self-made man may sometimes take the wrong road, but it's still his or her road to take. He says the self-made man can sometimes be a little bit boastful, a little bit vain, because he thinks or she thinks that they did it all by themselves, and it's not to say that they didn't get any help along the way. But he goes, nevertheless, the self-made man is ultimately the architect of his own destiny, is in the driver's seat of his own future. And so for Frederick Douglass, what freedom meant was, I'm not going to go to my master and say, hey, would you think about my happiness? Would you plan for my future? Will you give me a life dependent on you? But would you let me go so I can be my own master, so I can think for myself? This, I think, is what makes America the great country that she is. We make America great by making more self-made men and women. And we're not going to try to save the world or intervene all over the place here and there. If people want the American dream, we're not going to give them our troops and we're not going to give them our money, but we're happy to share our recipe. If you want to be like us, do it the way we did it. Liberate your citizens. Let them be the architect of their own destiny. We're unique in the world in this respect, and it's this uniqueness, I think, that's now in the balance. So this is a critical year. And sometimes when I think about the weight on our shoulders, it feels like it's heavy. We have so many forces arrayed against us. But on the other hand, at the end of the day, the truth is on our side, history is on our side, knowledge is on our side, and I think working together as a team in concert, we're going to do it because we're Americans. We're going to make it happen. Thank you very much. Thank you.